The Four Pests Campaign. Mao Zedong decided sparrows were a problem, not a minor nuisance, a national emergency. In 1958, Mao declared war on 4 pests as part of his Great Leap Forward campaign, and one of those pests was the Eurasian tree sparrow. His reasoning was simple. Sparrows ate grain. Grain fed people. Therefore, sparrows were enemies of the state. What followed was one of the most catastrophically stupid ecological decisions in recorded human history. The campaign was total. Chinese citizens were mobilized in enormous numbers to hunt sparrows to extinction. Children banged pots and pans. Adults waved flags and beat drums. People climbed trees and destroyed nests. Sparrows were chased without rest, because a sparrow that cannot land will eventually fall out of the sky from exhaustion. They shot them, they trapped them, they smashed eggs, they killed chicks. The campaign was treated with the same revolutionary seriousness as building a new China. Citizens competed to report their kill counts. The sparrow population of China collapsed. What Mao had not asked, and what no one around him apparently dared to say, was what sparrows actually ate. Yes, sparrows ate grain. They also ate insects. Specifically, they ate locusts. Within a single season of near total sparrow elimination, the insect population of China exploded in a way that had no natural check. Locusts descended on crops in numbers that defied description. The fields that Mao had intended to protect by removing sparrows were now being consumed at a scale that no human campaign could reverse. The famine that followed killed between 15 and 55 million people. The numbers remain contested because the Chinese government suppressed the evidence for decades. What is not contested is that it was one of the worst famines in human history, and it was caused in significant part by a decision to kill birds. Mao had looked at sparrows and seen enemies. The campaign was eventually quietly abandoned after ornithologists finally got access to Mao and explained what had happened. By then, the sparrows were gone, and the damage was done. The wrong turn that started a world war. On June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip was standing in front of a delicatessen in Sarajevo, eating a sandwich, having already given up on his mission for the day, when the car carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand made a wrong turn directly in front of him. That wrong turn ended the world as it existed. The assassination attempt that morning had already failed. A bomb had been thrown at the Archduke's car and bounced off, exploding under the vehicle behind it. The other conspirators positioned along the route had frozen, panicked, or failed to act. Princip had walked away, convinced the operation was over. He was 19 years old, standing on a street corner, when Franz Ferdinand's driver, apparently unaware of the changed route, turned onto Franz Joseph Street by mistake. Someone told the driver he had gone the wrong way. The driver stopped the car. He began to reverse. The engine stalled. The car sat motionless for several seconds directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, who was standing less than 5 feet away. Princip stepped forward and fired twice. Franz Ferdinand died within the hour. His wife died minutes before him. What followed was a chain of decisions made by old men in chancelleries across Europe who had built a system of alliances so rigid that a single assassination could drag every major power into war simultaneously. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Russia began mobilizing to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France was allied with Russia. Germany invaded France through Belgium. Britain was treaty-bound to defend Belgium. Within 6 weeks of a wrong turn on a Sarajevo street, the major powers of Europe were locked in the opening movements of a war that would kill 17 million people. Chernobyl. On the night of April 25, 1986, the operators at Chernobyl's reactor number 4 were running a safety test. The test was designed to determine whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough power to keep the cooling pumps running during the gap between a power failure and the activation of the emergency generators. It was, on paper, a routine procedure. What it became was the worst nuclear accident in history, and it became that because of a sequence of decisions that each made the situation slightly more dangerous than the last, until the reactor had nowhere left to go but apart. The test had already been delayed by 10 hours because the grid operator needed the power. When it finally began, the reactor was in an unstable state that the operators had not fully accounted for. To compensate for unexpected power loss during the delay, they had withdrawn nearly all of the control rods from the reactor core, far beyond what safety protocols permitted. The reactor was being held in a condition that the designers had explicitly warned against. The operators knew the rules. They proceeded anyway. When they attempted to stabilize power for the test, the reactor began behaving erratically. A safer decision at this moment would have been to stop. They did not stop. They had a schedule. They had supervisors watching. They had already waited 10 hours. They ran the test. The emergency core cooling system had been disabled to prevent it from interfering with the test results. The safety systems that existed specifically to prevent catastrophic failure were switched off because they were inconvenient. When the reactor began its final, uncontrolled power surge in the seconds before the explosion, the operators pressed the emergency shutdown button. The control rods began to descend into the core. Due to a flaw in their design that had been identified and never corrected, the tips of those rods momentarily accelerated the reaction rather than stopping it. The power output spiked to approximately 30,000 megawatts in a fraction of a second. The reactor exploded twice. The graphite core was exposed to open air and caught fire. Radioactive material was launched into the atmosphere. The operators in the control room, having just watched their reactor explode, initially refused to believe the core had been destroyed. They kept trying to pump water into a reactor that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. 31 people died in the immediate aftermath. The long-term death toll from radiation exposure remains disputed and ranges into the hundreds of thousands. An area the size of a small country became uninhabitable. It happened because a safety test was run on an already unstable reactor, with its emergency systems disabled and its safety margins exhausted, by operators who did not stop when every instrument in front of them was telling them to stop. Operation Barbarossa. In June of 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, with absolute certainty that it would be finished in 3 months. His generals had given him timelines. His planners had drawn up logistics. His ideology told him that the Soviet state was a hollow structure that would shatter on contact with German military force. He was wrong about all of it. And the wrongness killed approximately 27 million Soviet citizens and ended the military viability of the Third Reich. The German army that crossed into Soviet territory was enormous and initially devastating. It advanced faster than almost any army in history. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. The numbers were staggering, and still, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Hitler had planned for a state that would break. He had not planned for a state that would absorb losses of that magnitude and keep fighting. When the 3-month deadline passed and Moscow had not fallen, the German army was deep inside Soviet territory, with supply lines stretched to the point of dysfunction. The logistics had never been adequate for a prolonged campaign. The German army ran on horses to a degree that is rarely acknowledged, and those horses were dying in enormous numbers. Fuel, ammunition, and food were not reaching the front in sufficient quantities. The roads that existed in the Soviet Union were not built for the volume of traffic the invasion required. When autumn arrived, those roads turned to mud so deep that vehicles sank to their axles and could not be moved. The German advance slowed to almost nothing. Then winter came. The German army did not have winter equipment because the war was supposed to be over. Soldiers were fighting in temperatures of -30 and -40 degrees Celsius in the uniforms they had worn in the summer. Engines would not start. Oil froze. Weapons jammed. Men lost fingers and toes and ears to frostbite while requesting winter gear that the supply system could not deliver. The Soviet forces, equipped for the cold and fighting on their own territory, counterattacked. The German army that had seemed unstoppable in June was fighting for survival by December. Hitler had looked at the Soviet Union and seen what he wanted to see. He had not seen the depth of the country, the resilience of its population, or the impossibility of supplying a modern army across thousands of kilometers of deteriorating roads into an endless winter. The invasion was doomed by the assumptions that launched it.